Greetings. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Anne McKellar, PhD Research Scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, will be speaking about using new technologies to track terns in the prairies and beyond. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Before we begin, I'd like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. Join us on April 12th for a webinar about City Nature Challenge Saskatoon and area, sorting out noxious invasives from beneficial pollinator species by the Friends of Saskatoon Afforestation Areas. We're also looking forward to a webinar about bobolinks and agricultural practices by Julia Putt of Grasslands National Park on May 3rd. You can register for these webinars on the PCAP website, and all past webinar presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel. And this presentation will be uploaded there in the near future as well. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type into the questions section at the end of the dashboard at any time during the presentation, and questions will be moderated at the end of the webinar. If you're on a cell phone app, you can send your question by chat to the organizer. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar has been provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, Eco-Friendly Sask, Enbridge, Information Services Corporation, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, SaskTel, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. In-kind support has been provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now a bit about today's presenter. Dr. Anne McKellar is a research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada's Science and Technology branch, where her research program aims to understand the drivers of population change in prairie migratory birds and species at risk. She's based in Saskatoon, where she's also an adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan. Prior to joining the Science and Technology branch in October 2021, Anne worked for 8 years as a waterbird and shorebird biologist for the Canadian Wildlife Service. Some of her current and past projects include tracking migratory birds through their annual cycle using various technologies, MODIS wildlife telemetry, light level geolocators, stable isotopes, and testing the use of drones to monitor water birds on the prairies. Before joining the CWS, Anne completed her PhD at Queen's University on American redstarts and worked as a postdoc at the University of Columbia, Missouri, where she studied demography and movement of the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Anne.
Okay, thank you. Are you seeing my full screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Good to go.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Caitlin, and really excited to be here today. I'd say for my part, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, where I'm lucky enough to live and to be able to do field work on this beautiful land, some of which I'll be talking to you about today. So I'm really excited to be talking about one of my favorite groups of birds, the terns. And I'm not sure, for those of you who have the video on, I've got my Tern t-shirt on here, which has 9 of the around 44 worldwide species of terns on it. And specifically today, I'll be talking about 2 species, the common tern, which is shown in the center photo here, and the black tern just to its left. And then at the very end, I'm going to touch very briefly on the Forster's tern, which you can see on the far left. And so I'll be talking to you today about projects that I've been involved with where we've been tracking annual cycle movements and population structure in order to try to determine causes of population declines in these species. And so as way of introduction, I'll talk a little bit about waterbirds. Waterbirds are important aspects of the aquatic ecosystem, and they're often used as indicators of wetland health. However, many species are declining worldwide due to issues such as habitat loss and degradation, especially prominent here on the prairies, water regulation and agriculture, as well as human disturbance. However, for many of these species, we're often lacking knowledge about their full annual cycle, especially the habitats and areas that they use outside of the breeding period. In addition to that, many of these species are difficult to survey because of the fact that they're nesting in these large aggregations, often in remote and inaccessible areas. And because of this, large-scale monitoring programs such as the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is a roadside survey, often don't capture these birds very well. And as a result, we don't get population trend information from this survey for these species. And it's been estimated that about a third of waterbird species worldwide have poor or no monitoring data, poor quality or no monitoring data. I'd also like to highlight the prairie pothole region, which, as many of you probably know, is often called the duck factory of North America. But I would argue that, that for many of these species of waterbirds, this is also the waterbird factory. So the area, the core of the range where we often have the highest densities of several or many of these species of gulls, grebes, herons, and terns. And if we take a sort of historical look at these waterbirds, waterbirds were really hard hit by the millinery trade in the 1800s and early 1900s, when it was fashionable for women to wear feathers or whole birds on their hats. And this was a big deal in North America as well as in Europe. Hundreds of millions of birds were hunted for this trade. And in Europe, the real focus was on exotic birds or birds of paradise, but here in North America, it was really the water birds, these herons, grebes, and terns, because it was easy for hunters to go out to a big colony and collect, hundreds or even thousands of birds kind of in one go. But on the positive side, this concerns about the populations of these species contributed to some of the earliest conservation movements of the 1900s, as well as the creation of the very first Audubon societies, which were actually, the membership was primarily women in those early days, and it was women who were trying to convince the fashion industry and other women to put an end to this and to not wear these birds on their fashion clothing. And this also contributed to the formation of the Migratory Bird Treaty between Canada and the US, which protects migratory birds, their nests, and their eggs. So fast forward to today, many of these species were able to recover from this, but nowadays are facing a multitude of new threats, as well as issues with pesticides that occurred in the 60s and 70s, but nowadays other threats such as ongoing habitat loss, degradation, and climate change, which I've already mentioned. So focusing in a little bit on the species that I'll be talking about today, as I said, first of all, common terns. So they nest here in the prairies, but they also have coastal populations on the Atlantic coast, and I'll show you some range maps in just a moment. They tend to nest on larger water bodies in kind of larger colonies on rocky islands, barrier beaches, and salt marshes. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, they are not well surveyed by the North American Breeding Bird Survey, but fortunately for these species, we do have good data from colony-specific surveys, both on the Atlantic coast and throughout the inland areas in the Great Lakes, where there's a decadal colonial waterbird survey, as well as some work that we've recently done on the large lakes of Manitoba. Blackturns, in terms of their life history and habitat use, are a little bit different. They're one of what's known as the marsh terns. So they nest at these inland marshes, typically in smaller colonies as compared to the common terns, and at smaller water bodies. And as a result, they're a little bit of an exception to the rule in that we do get reasonably reliable data from them from the Breeding Bird Survey. which tends to do a better job at sampling these kind of smaller wetlands where these birds breed. So when I talk about population trends, I'll be referring to breeding bird survey data for this species. And then, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention the other terns that occur in the prairies. Forster's tern, which as I said, I'll talk about a bit later. Caspian terns, which I won't be talking about today, but are really cool birds, the largest species of tern. And I think, yeah, really neat, really pretty and interesting birds. So talking a little bit more about population trends. So we know that, as I mentioned a moment ago, the Migratory Bird Convention Act in Canada protects these birds, but certain species of birds and other species gain additional protection through the Species at Risk Act if they're listed as species at risk. Now, these terns that I'm talking about are not listed as species at risk, yet they are experiencing population declines in some regions. So you can see the range map here of the common tern. As I mentioned, there are these Atlantic coastal populations. You can see the breeding range in green, and then populations that breed throughout the Great Lakes and out here in the west. But what's interesting is if we look at trend information from these colony-specific surveys, population trends are actually quite variable across the range. So these Atlantic coastal populations appear to be doing okay. They're stable or even increasing in some cases. However, inland populations in the Great Lakes and out west in the large lakes of Manitoba have been declining quite precipitously. And you can see that here in these two trend graphs. On the left-hand side, this is data from the Great Lakes colonial waterbird census, which shows about a 40% decline since the 1970s. And then work that we've done here over in Manitoba showing a steep decline of about 77% since the 90s, and that's despite increases that the species was showing since the 1970s, presumably after recovering from issues such as pesticides. So I mentioned that these are not listed as species at risk, but interestingly enough, they were assessed for potential listing back in 1998 by COSEWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, basically an independent body that assesses species and makes a recommendation as to whether they should be listed as a species at risk. But at the time, they received an assessment of not at risk, basically for the same reasons that I've just shown you. There were variable population trends across the range, but overall, if you look at the overall Canadian population, there was stability. So even back then, we had declines on the Great Lakes, but kind of stable or increases in the Atlantic populations, which continue today. And as a result, the species is listed in several states that border the Great Lakes as either state listed as either threatened or endangered. What about Blackturns? Well, we sort of see a similar pattern for Blackturns, although a little bit different. Both long and short-term declines, but again, variable across the range. But here what we tend to see is that the core of the range in the prairie pothole region tends to be the area with the more positive population trends, whereas peripheral areas seem to have stronger negative trends. So you can see this here. These kind of bluish, lighter colors are representing increasing populations based on the breeding bird survey from the past 10 or so years, and these redder colors are decreases. So again, what about in terms of a species at risk perspective? Interestingly enough, this species was also assessed in the 1990s. It seems like in the 90s there was a big push for assessing a bunch of different waterbirds. And there was the recommendation that they be listed as vulnerable, which is nowadays is known as species of special concern in the species at risk lingo. However, in the end, it was determined that they were not at risk because of the fact that this apparent long-term decline seemed to have abated in recent years leading up to that assessment. So, which is sort of similar to what we see today, these long-term declines, but short-term declines that aren't quite severe enough to trigger listing of the species, despite these kind of differences across the range. The species is listed as special concern in Ontario, as well as listed in several US states. So the goal of our research was to really try to answer some of these questions as to, what are the main threats, where are they occurring throughout the annual cycle, and starting to get a grasp of why we have these different population trends in these different breeding populations. So to do this, we were examining full annual cycle movements using tracking devices, as well as looking at population structure from genetic data to look at some of these questions. As I said, where are populations most limited, and what are some of the threats and drivers? So I want to introduce this term migratory connectivity that many of you are probably familiar with, because I'll be referring to this throughout my talk. And this is basically spatial and temporal linkages of individuals and populations across the annual cycle. And when we say strong migratory connectivity, what this tends to mean is that individuals from different breeding populations tend to remain separated in different non-breeding populations during the wintering period, whereas under weak connectivity, individuals from different breeding populations tend to mix with each other, with individuals from different populations on the non-breeding grounds. And so this is shown in this figure on the right, with an example of strong connectivity on the top and weak connectivity on the bottom. And you can imagine that a particular localized threat or a catastrophic event would have different knock-on effects to breeding populations depending on the degree of connectivity. So for example, a particular threat under weak connectivity down here on the non-breeding grounds might have more of a diffuse effect across multiple breeding populations. I wanted to point out as well that connectivity sort of depends on the scale that you look at. And this is demonstrated nicely in this study by Fraser et al. On purple martins. And what I wanted to highlight here is that, so for this study, they were tracking individual birds from various breeding populations shown as these stars. And if you were to look at North America as a whole, you probably conclude that there's strong migratory connectivity in this species. And that's because individuals from this kind of far western population tended to remain isolated from individuals in the center and eastern populations during the non-breeding period, as you can see here. But if you were to zoom in a little bit and only focus on those central and eastern breeding populations, you'd probably conclude that there is weak connectivity, because individuals from all of these different breeding populations showed a high degree of overlap in the areas that they used on their non-breeding grounds, kind of here in central and northern Brazil. And then I also wanted to introduce population genetics and why are we interested in this. Well, genetic differentiation can be important because it can allow individuals to adapt to local conditions. However, too much isolation or too much differentiation can be a problem, because gene flow is important for maintaining diversity and preventing inbreeding. Now, from a species at risk perspective, this is also important because under the Species at Risk Act, a population of a species can have different designatable units assigned to it if there's evidence that these different parts of the population are evolutionarily distinct from one another. And this is the case, for example, in piping plovers, which has two different designatable units, the prairie population and the Atlantic population, which are basically assessed separately. Although in this case, they're both listed as endangered. Okay, so with that, I want to get into my first case study talking about common terns. So before I get started on our study, what is already known about common tern migration from banding data? Well, I mentioned before that this is a pretty well studied species in North America. There's been a lot of banding that's gone on the breeding grounds, especially in the Atlantic coastal populations and the Great Lakes. And we can sort of start to get a sense of some patterns here by looking at banding data. So all of these circles, these dots, I guess, are places where individuals were banded, and then you can see these shaded areas where they were either resighted or recovered dead. And you can see that these birds that were banded on the Atlantic coast tended to be recovered almost exclusively on the Atlantic coast of South America, whereas birds banded in the Great Lakes and farther west tended to be recovered on the west coast of Mexico, Central and South America. So we're starting to get this sense that these different breeding populations might be separating from, but be remaining separate on the non-breeding grounds. However, there are limitations to band recovery data. Sample sizes are very small. Recovery effort is variable across the range. So if there's nobody looking for birds or nobody collecting these carcasses, then you're not getting any information. They're also just providing kind of a snapshot in time. You don't have any information of where these birds came from, how long they spent at their different staging sites, and any variation among individuals. So for that, we really need to use tracking data. And so for the work, for much of the work I'll be talking about today, we've been using light level geolocators to track these birds. Now these are small, lightweight, cheap devices that are relatively simple in that they basically just record light levels. And from the timing of sunrise and sunset and the total day length, one can calculate an approximate latitude and longitude each day when the bird was wearing this device, with an error of several hundred kilometers. But one real important thing to note about these devices is that they're archival, meaning they log their data, but they don't transmit it. So one needs to be able to recapture an individual in order to get the data back. And this is definitely a drawback, but it's also, allows these devices to be very lightweight and safe to use on some of the smaller species. Not such a big deal with common terns, which are a bit bigger, but for the Blackturns, which I'll be talking about in just a little bit, this is kind of, just on the threshold of the 3% body mass rule, which is basically for animal welfare perspectives, we're not supposed to put anything on a bird that's more than about 3% of their body mass. So around the time when these devices were really being pioneered for use on small songbirds, there was an early study using geolocators on common terns. And now this map might look a little bit rough. Nowadays, there are more sophisticated statistical techniques for analyzing geolocator data, but back in the day, this is sort of what it looked like. So this group, led by Ian Nisbet and colleagues, put out 10 geolocators on an Atlantic coastal population, on individuals from an Atlantic coastal population in the late 2000s. They recovered 6 of the devices, 5 of them with data, so not a huge sample size, but nonetheless showing very similar pattern to what we saw with the banding data, in that these individuals remained exclusively on the Atlantic coast during their migration and winter periods. And you can see these different circles, areas where they spent more significant portions of the winter period. So for our research, we were really interested in filling the gap in those inland birds. So we know that these Atlantic populations, we seem to know, kind of what they're doing in the wintertime. We know that they're reasonably stable breeding populations, but what about these declining inland birds? So the work I'm describing here was led by then PhD student Annie Bracey, now Dr. Annie Bracey. And for this work, we deployed geolocators at sites throughout the inland populations, ranging from Lake Winnipeg, where I worked, to sites where our colleagues worked in Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Oneida Lake in New York. And throughout 2013 to 2015, we deployed just over 100 geolocators, and we recovered a little over 50% of them, which for a geolocator study is actually pretty good. So I'll jump right into what some of these migration tracks look like here. And so I'm calling this a gradient in migration routes. And what I mean by that is that, so we have our breeding populations from west to east here in these panels from left to right. And our two more western breeding populations, here you can see southward migration tracks in blue and northward tracks in red, and each line is an individual bird. So these farther western breeding individuals tended to migrate down the Atlantic coast, but then follow a bit more of a westward route when going north, leading many individuals through the Gulf of Mexico and then kind of up over an inland northward migration route. So kind of showing this a bit of an elliptical migration pattern. Whereas if we look at our more western breeding populations, they're more, they showed more of a sort of straight north-south migration using the Atlantic flyway during both migrations. But two important things I want to point out is that, first of all, we found that individuals showed a high degree of movement during the wintertime. So unlike some songbird species, for example, that might go down to their non-breeding grounds and establish a territory and stay there for the whole, for our whole winter period, these birds instead tended to move around quite a bit. So they might spend, you know, a couple of weeks here, a month or two there. So lots of movement. And then the other thing I want to point out is that individuals from across all of these different populations tended to show a high degree of overlap, so with individuals from other populations. And you can sort of see that here in this map, which is showing pie charts of that are colored by colony, by breeding colony. And you can see that there's a high degree of overlap in site use among individuals from different breeding colonies, as well as kind of what I'm calling a hotspot here in Peru and a little bit in Ecuador, where many individuals were found. I think it was about 70% of all birds spent at least some time in this area around Peru. So what does this imply in terms of migratory connectivity? Well, again, getting back to that idea that connectivity depends on scale. So across North American blackturns as a whole, what we're seeing is strong migratory connectivity because these Atlantic populations are remaining almost entirely separated during the non-breeding period compared to our inland birds. But just focusing in on the inland birds, this is an evidence of weak connectivity because individuals from these different breeding populations showed a high degree of overlap. And then in addition, as I mentioned, a catastrophic event, as I mentioned earlier, a catastrophic event, for example, somewhere like Peru would have negative effects on multiple inland breeding birds. So now I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about the genetic work, which I was not involved in, but some of my colleagues and collaborators, Patty Skiz, Jennifer Arnold, and Stephen Oswald have been, among others, have been doing this great work over the past year, few years, and one study that just came out. And what they found, as is what you might predict, is that there is indeed population genetic structure here, with Atlantic birds being significantly genetically different from inland birds, but that these inland birds they cluster together basically. So we have these two genetic clusters, the Atlantic and then the combined inland Manitoba and Great Lakes populations. And what they've also found is that there's evidence of recent movement or gene flow out of the Great Lakes, but not into it. And this is interesting because we know that these Great Lakes populations are declining, but this is providing evidence that it might not be a matter of, or entirely a matter of low survivorship or productivity. It could be that these birds are also permanently emigrating out of the Great Lakes. And this is interesting because this supports the hypothesis that non-breeding distribution can be a strong driver of breeding site differentiation in waterbirds, which is one of the drivers that's thought to maintain genetic diversity in waterbirds and seabirds, which are species that don't often face physical barriers to dispersal. And the argument made by these authors in their paper is that this could be driven by the use of flyways by these different populations. So what I mean by that is I'm showing the maps again on the bottom from our inland birds, and the fact that these birds travel via the Atlantic coast during their migration means that they could be mixing with these Atlantic coastal birds, potentially prospecting for new breeding areas and then potentially returning to breed at those areas in future years. Whereas the reverse isn't true. The Atlantic coastal populations never have the chance really to prospect or to pass over inland populations. So this could be what's contributing to this kind of biased gene flow and loss of individuals from some of these inland populations. So I'll talk a little bit more about kind of implications of that at the end, but now I want to switch gears and talk about our case study on Blackturns. So basically mirroring the same methodology that we used for the common tern studies. But first off, what do we know from band recovery data? Well, not as much as we know from the common tern. So this is, I've mapped here some data from the bird banding office, which is showing you all of these little dots are places that black terns have been banded, and then any of these lines connect places where birds have been resighted or recaptured. So you can see there isn't a ton. And so for the work I'm talking about today in terms of our tracking and genetics, this is work that's been led by my master's student, Nick Shepard, who's recently graduated and is going to be starting a PhD. But for this work, Nick was looking at tracking data from black terns banded at colonies in Saskatchewan, Michigan, and Ontario. And so we deployed geolocators throughout 2016 to 2019, retrieved them in subsequent years. And out of 88 geolocators deployed, we had a recapture rate of about 19%, which is quite a bit lower than the over 50% that we had for the common terns. And I think there are some important reasons for this that I'll get into as I go through. And one thing that's interesting to note is that recapture rates were highly variable across the breeding populations. So as you can see here, we actually had 3 study colonies in Saskatchewan, but the first 2 colonies where we worked, we basically had a 0% recapture rate. And for those of you in Saskatchewan, you might remember in the years 2019 and 2020, we had a real extreme drought. And as a result, especially this, what I'm calling Bricksaw Marsh here, our main study colony where we started working, was actually very dry in the subsequent year and following deployment, and habitat conditions just really weren't there for terns to be nesting. And actually by the year after, it was completely dry. And this is despite the fact that we had done our homework. We knew that this had historically been a very stable colony that had a large number of nesting birds there for several years before we started our study. So we kind of switched gears and conducted our banding on Jackfish Lake in 2019. So this was a wetland on a very large lake. So we were confident that if even if dry conditions persisted, that there would still be enough water there for nesting. And indeed, the colonies did persist, and we were able to recapture about 13% of the banded birds, of the tagged birds. However, this is still quite a bit lower than the around 30 to 35% recapture rate that we had at our Michigan and Ontario study sites. And so we're starting to get a picture of there seems to be a high degree of interannual movement or breeding dispersal in this species, particularly in the prairies. And this could be due to the wet-dry cycles that we have, and these birds are simply adapted to move around quite a bit between years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that breeding dispersal as I go. But nonetheless, I want to show you some results here, and I'll start by showing you the migration tracks of our eastern breeding populations, so Ontario and Michigan, where we have the larger sample size. And again, I'm showing the southward migration in blue, the northward migration in red, and all of these lines being different individuals. And we can see a pattern that's reasonably similar to the common terns, a bit of this sort of elliptical migration with migration, southward migration down the Atlantic coast, northward migration kind of a bit farther west through the Gulf of Mexico, and then up around the Mississippi flyway. But similar to the common terns, we found that individuals moved around a lot during the wintertime, and showed individuals from these two populations showing a high degree of overlap. And you can also see on the heat map on the right here kind of where birds were most concentrated. And in contrast to the common terns, which seem to really have their hotspot around Peru, these black terns were really concentrated around Panama. And in fact, every single individual tracked spent at least some of their non-breeding period in this area around Panama or off the coast. And so again, we can think about a particular threat or catastrophic event that would occur somewhere where these birds are concentrated could have effects on multiple breeding populations. So what about our Saskatchewan birds? Well, smaller sample size here, but again, we can see they tended to use the central flyway during their southward migration, with these individuals traveling a little farther west during their northward migration, over doing a bit of an oversea migration route before coming back up the central flyway. But the important thing here to point out is that despite the use of different flyways, individuals from our western population and our eastern populations showed a high degree of overlap in the areas that they used in the non-breeding period. So this is evidence of weak migratory connectivity. So you can see here an example, or see what this looks like here with these individuals kind of using different flyways, but basically overlapping in their non-breeding site use, as well as showing kind of a hot spot in Panama. So we're starting to get evidence of movement of these birds. And for those of you who are really paying attention, you might have seen when I showed the maps of these eastern breeding populations, this really weird line, this weird individual that seems to lead out to Manitoba. So what's going on there? This is actually a really interesting situation, data that you almost never get from these types of archival tags, because of the fact that usually if a bird leaves, it never comes back and you never get that information back. But in this case, this individual was actually tagged in Ontario in 2016 and was recovered in 2019. But in the 2017 breeding season, actually flew out and spent the breeding period in Manitoba. So you can see the 2017 northward migration route is the one shown in solid red here. And this bird apparently on its way north passed by the Ontario site or somewhere nearby, but then went on to travel about 1,400 kilometers towards the west to breed here in Manitoba. So really interesting evidence of long distance breeding dispersal. And it makes you think that, depending on where we first located this bird, we might think of it, you might think of this as an Ontario bird that showed this kind of one anomalous breeding event out in Manitoba. But if we had captured this bird first in Manitoba, we might think the reverse. So really interesting that these birds seem to be moving around quite a bit. And for those of you who are familiar with Manitoba and the Interlake region, I just want to show a little map here, kind of showing our best approximation of where this bird was found during the breeding period. And I'd love to I'd love to spend more time searching around there, looking for black tern colonies and seeing what the populations look like out there. So that's long distance breeding dispersal, but as I implied earlier, we also have evidence for short distance dispersal based on the low return rates we had in Saskatchewan, the colony abandonment. But what I didn't mention is that those 3 birds that we did recapture on Jackfish Lake were actually found breeding on the same lake, but in a different wetland than where we had initially tagged them, about 2.5 kilometers away. And this movement was, we couldn't really figure out why, because their original breeding colony, the habitat conditions didn't seem to have changed. There were other black terns that stayed there, and yet we had movement of certain individuals to this other colony. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that breeding dispersal and kind of next steps at what we'd like to do to examine that more closely. But first, I'll tell you about our genetic work. So this is also being led by Nick. And for this work, we had blood samples from 8 colonies across the range, a total of 147 individuals. And we were looking at genetic structure and gene flow via microsatellites and mitochondrial diversity via cytochrome B. And what we found is probably exactly what you would predict based on what you've seen so far, is that there was no evidence for genetic structure in this species. Basically, the whole North American population clusters together, or in other words, shows complete panmixia. So you don't really need to worry about the details of this structure plot, but if you're familiar with these, you would expect, if there was genetic differentiation, you'd expect these colors to be clustering in particular areas, but instead what we're seeing is that there's no evidence for any clustering whatsoever. And then similarly, looking at this mitochondrial haplotype network, we can see evidence of a lot of genetic diversity, so many different haplotypes, but also that these haplotypes many of them are shared amongst multiple breeding populations, so with these different colors representing the different breeding populations. So all in all, no evidence of genetic structure in the species. And this again supports that hypothesis that the shared use of non-breeding areas can potentially contribute to gene flow and panmixia in waterbirds. So for example, these birds might be, interacting with individuals from different populations across the breeding range during the winter period, and then potentially, traveling or migrating with those individuals to new or different breeding sites, leading to greater gene flow and a lack of genetic structure. And this is interesting because it does contrast with what's been found in the Eurasian subspecies of black terns, where those species actually show, or that subspecies actually shows strong genetic structure, which is associated with use of distinct flyways and different non-breeding areas. So I wanted to touch briefly on next steps and looking at this question of breeding dispersal. And so for this work that Nick is continuing for his PhD, we're using nanotags and the MODIS network to try to answer questions about breeding dispersal in the species. So these nanotags are basically miniaturized radio transmitters that emit a unique pulse. And these radio pulses can be picked up by a station or by a network of stationary receiving towers that are spread throughout North America. And so as pilot work for this in 2021, we put out a number of these nanotags on black terns, and the battery life on these tags is predicted to be greater than 1 year. So we're hoping to examine patterns of movement once these birds return to the breeding grounds in this year. And so I wanted to show, if this is going to work, I wanted to show a real quick animation which demonstrates the southward migration of these birds, and our fingers are crossed that that the tags will stay on and that we'll soon be starting to get some northward migration hits. So basically here what I'm going to show you, these arrows are going to represent individuals, and then there'll be a series of red lines that'll show you detections on one tower followed by detections on another tower. So this MODIS data isn't giving you information in real time, but it's giving you, wherever there are these stationary towers, you're getting information on when a bird passed by there. So I'll play this little animation here. So yeah, you can see birds starting out being detected at our tower in Saskatchewan, and then a few traveling south through the mid-continent, several detections in Missouri, and then quite a few in the Gulf of Mexico. So generally similar patterns to what we saw with the geolocators, but with a greater sample size here. Now, unfortunately, the MODIS tower coverage isn't quite as, there isn't quite as much coverage down in South America, so we are lacking in detections there. But as I mentioned, we're hoping that these tags stay on and that our birds will be coming back, and that we'll be able to track them if they're moving to new breeding sites around our study sites in Saskatchewan. Okay, so jumping back here to our two case studies. To summarize, so basically for the common tern, we see strong population genetic structure, strong migratory connectivity between Atlantic and inland birds, but also, and that goes hand in hand with different population trends. So stable populations on the Atlantic, but quite severe declines in these inland populations, which may be a result potentially of issues occurring outside of the breeding range, but could also be due to this kind of biased movement of breeding individuals, especially out of the Great Lakes. Blackturns, on the other hand, we see evidence of weak genetic or no genetic structure, lots of overlap on the wintering grounds, and yet we continue to see these steeper population declines on the range peripheries. So to me, this implies something potentially going on the breeding grounds rather than on the wintering grounds that could be more negatively affecting certain breeding populations. So from a designatable unit perspective, we do have evidence for potential designatable units, or perhaps evolutionarily significant populations in the common tern, but certainly not for the black tern. I promised that I would talk a little bit about Forster's tern. I think this is probably North America's most understudied, most poorly known tern species. They're really interesting because they're the only North American tern that spends their entire life cycle almost entirely within North America. But you can see they have kind of a different disjunct breeding populations. So the kind of core of the range in the prairies here, but also these disjunct populations in California and Oregon. And also you can see here in purple, these are, there are year-round populations in the Gulf of Mexico, which also breed there. So I'd say in terms of habitat preferences, these birds are a little bit in between black terns and common terns in that they do tend to nest in larger colonies in marshes, but they tend to be kind of more isolated and kind of patchily distributed. So as a result, there's really no good population trend information available for these birds. And interestingly enough, as I mentioned before, these, all these birds being assessed, all these waterbirds being assessed in the 90s, Forster's terns were also assessed by COSEWIC in 1996, and it was deemed that they were data deficient. And I would say that if the same were to be done today, if a new assessment were to be done, they would probably also be data deficient today. Nonetheless, there is some concern. They're on the red list in BC as well as listed in several states. So I want to conclude by saying that yeah, I think that inland waterbirds are often overlooked, but better information about full annual cycle dynamics and population structure may change this and may also allow for more effective conservation strategies. I did want to mention that new tools may help improve monitoring coverage. Some work that I didn't have time to talk about today that I've been involved with has used drones and used both visible and thermal imagery to detect the nests of these species and get accurate colony counts. And I'm showing some example imagery here of Franklin's gulls and western grebes, but we also have data from Forster's terns, Blackturns, and black-crowned night herons. And so with that, yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention today, and I would be happy to take questions.
First of all, thank you so much for the great presentation. I've already had a couple comments come in from the attendees to say that was a really great presentation, really informative. So thank you, Anne. We do have a couple questions. The first one is from Thuy, and I just need to find it on my screen here. There it is. Could you elaborate more about the process of how to attach the geolocators into birds? And for example, the rules to select the individual bird, and regarding the low recapture rate, are there any opportunities to improve it?
Yeah, great questions. So for this study, we were using a geolocator attached to a leg band. So basically the same kind of setup as you'd have for a regular colored leg band that goes on a bird, except it has the little extra device on it. For our work for these species, we were generally within the acceptable weight range, so we didn't need to worry about which particular individual we were selecting. In certain studies, if you're right on that threshold, that 3% threshold of kind of animal care, animal welfare issues, you might choose to put your devices only on the heaviest of birds. So you might capture a bird, you might weigh it, put a regular aluminum band on, take all your measurements, and then decide whether that's an individual that you're also going to put the geolocator on. In terms of improving recapture rates, I mean, that's a really tough question because with the Blackturns, I feel like it's almost like these tags, these archival tags are maybe not the best way to go, because if individuals are showing dispersal from year to year, then you're just not, you're not going to have a chance to be able to recapture those individuals. So what I would like to see in the future is these more sophisticated tags that, GPS tags that actually transmit their data. Once those become kind of small enough that they could safely be placed on these birds, then that would be an additional tool that we could use. Yeah, I think that
would be really neat when that becomes available.
Yeah.
Another listener's wondering, how do you catch the birds?
Good question. We're using traps on the nest. So for common terns, this is a little bit easier because they're nesting on the ground. And there's a few different types of traps. You can have basically a walk-in trap where the bird kind of walks back onto its eggs and triggers a little door that closes. You can also have a bow net trap that kind of sits flush on the ground, and then when the bird comes back to the nest, you can activate the trigger and the net will come over and capture the bird. Similar for Blackturns, but we have to be a bit more careful because we're working in the marsh and they kind of have more sensitive, kind of flimsier nests in the vegetation. But same thing, these kind of traps that the bird can basically fly down into, but then not be able to get out of. And we have to, keep a close eye on it so that we go and retrieve them from the trap as quick as possible.
That makes sense. Did you have to practice this ahead of time to get good at it?
A little bit, yeah. We receive training. Always get a lot of training before you do it, and watch people who have experience do it before, and definitely sort of just testing the traps on the ground to make sure everything's working before you put it on an actual nest.
For sure, that makes sense. What other measurements did you collect on the birds?
Basically the standard morphometric measurements, so body mass, bill length, wing length, tarsus length. We collected a feather from each bird. We collected a very small blood sample from each bird to be able to sex them genetically. So these birds, we can't tell males from females in the hand. Males tend to be a tiny bit larger, but there's a lot of overlap. So with that small bit of blood, we're able to get the the genetic sex data, although I should say for the birds that were in the specific genetic study, we collected a slightly larger sample of blood for the genetic analysis.
That makes sense. Thank you. Um, for people who are interested in getting to know more about birds and kind of taking it to the next level, like you're obviously very fluent with bird species, what would you recommend for people to start learning more about birds?
Yeah, there's a ton of resources out there. There's an app called Merlin, which is really good. You can put it on your phone and it's kind of, um, a beginner bird app, although experts use it as well. And you can start by trying to, identify birds around your neighborhood.
Mhm.
Depending on where you're located, here in Saskatchewan, the Birds Canada often runs workshops about, beginner bird ID. You can sign up with programs with Birds Canada to start volunteering with their surveys and learn more and get training in that way. So yeah, those are just a couple of ways.
Yeah, Birds Canada is a great resource. Thanks for recommending them. For you personally, how did you get involved with birds? It seems like you have a lifetime of experience with birding. What was the initial interest with birds?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I did my undergraduate in biology and I wasn't immediately all that interested in birds. I always liked animals, but I think it was, an animal behavior course that I took probably in my third year of undergraduate, where we started talking about animal behavior and getting into, some of the research that's been done on birds. And I was just really fascinated by the different behaviors that they exhibit, and all of the different plumages, and yeah, I just sort of got hooked from there. And yeah, I wanted to keep studying birds, so I just continued with grad school, and was really excited to be able to take on a government job where our focus is more on the conservation aspects. So
For sure,
it's
for
really
sure.
rewarding.
Yeah. What do you think is the most important thing that people can do to help bird conservation in Canada? Do you have any recommendations for our attendees today?
Yeah. Well, one of the big ones that people always talk about is keeping your cats indoors, or otherwise, making sure that outdoor cats aren't preying on bird species.
Mhm.
And there's a variety of different ways that can be done. Um, there's
That's a really good one. I've posted a
yeah,
lot about that on PCAP social media, and yeah, I know I have a neighbor that's their cat took down a common nighthawk, and it was kind of tragic to see that. And yeah, so thanks
yeah.
for that recommendation. Another question here: did you find that the black tern's nesting success more or less than the common terns?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that specifically. I would
Hmm.
guess the answer is probably yes, based on other studies that have been done. It seems like black tern breeding success is very low at the places where that has been specifically studied. And as part of Nick's continuing work, he's going to be looking at that specifically in Saskatchewan. But yeah, we do suspect that black terns have quite low nesting success, and the common terns is more kind of more typical of what you'd expect from a water bird.
That makes sense. And you and I were talking a little bit earlier about research that you have coming up or ideas for research. Could you let our attendees know what you're thinking about for researching in the future?
Sure, yeah. Well, we want to continue some of this work with black terns. I think for common terns specifically, there's really a bit of a data gap kind of in the more northern boreal areas. So we don't really have a good sense of whether those are a distinct population that might be separate genetically, or on the non-breeding grounds from the rest of the populations. We really don't know anything um, about their breeding success either. We do have the suspicion that, like similar to some duck species, when conditions aren't good on the prairies, then they might just overfly and breed in the boreal, and so some common tern populations might be doing that. Other research I have going on with Arctic breeding shorebirds that stage in the prairies. So we do a lot of work at Chaplin Lake, which is a great birding spot. Um, and yeah, there's lots on the go, but that's just a couple of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll have to have you come back again to our speaker series one day and give us an update with some of your new research. And yeah, that would be awesome. And we're right on the hour here. So before I let you go, the picture there on the question slide, I love it. Did you take that yourself?
That was taken by one of my field assistants on the
Okay.
Common Tern project. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, you've had
So
some great
I'm not
pictures
a,
in the
I'm not a great
presentation.
photographer. I tend
Me
to
either.
steal
That's why I have to
things.
ask. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. Again, there's been more comments coming in, people saying thank you for the fabulous presentation. So thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our attendees, thank you so much for catching our Native Prairie Speaker Series. We have another one next week. Check out the PCAP website for how to register for that. And when you leave today's presentation, there will be a quick 1-minute survey. If you don't mind filling that out, we really appreciate it. We can report back to our funders and keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going into the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.